welcome to the Conversations at the Vessel. We are extremely happy and honored to have Professor Neelkanth Chhaya with us today as our guest.
Professor Chhaya graduated from Ahmedabad in the mid-70s and spent the early part of his professional career in Nairobi, both practicing and teaching. He returned to India in the early 80s to set up collaborative practice here. And at the same time, he started teaching at SEP and only retired as a Dean of the Faculty of Architecture at the SEP University in 2013. Since then, he has been closely associated with Srishti Institute of Design, Bangalore, and of course has been on the advisory board and committee of many education institutions across India. He is a common name and an invaluable contributor to a lot of design and pedagogy conferences, not only in India, but also internationally.
And he's been our teacher while we were studying at the School of Architecture, SEP, 20 years ago. And occasionally we keep going back to him for advice and conversations. And that's the beautiful thing, that his relationship with students extends much beyond the academic domain. And so it was only natural for us to approach him for these conversations where we are trying to make sense of the condition that we are in today, not only as architects, but as human beings. So thank you so much, sir, for being here. With the pandemic setting in, we have been confined to our homes for the past few months, and normal life as we knew it has come to a standstill. There's a lot of anxiety and fear about the future. But on the other hand, this is also a moment which has tremendous potential for pause and silence, which can be liberating as well as transforming. The question is, how do we reconcile these different states, and what do we hold on to at the moment?
Yeah. These are difficult questions, no? I was thinking that thinking about the future is a very slippery thing. One might turn out to be completely wrong. And even if we were right, that what we thought and turned out to be right would be still somewhat different from what we thought about. Similarly, thinking about the past is also a very, very problematic. But we do need to think about both of these. But I think they both benefit if our primary attention is on the present. What am I doing now? What are my relationships with you, or with the plant outside, or with the rain that will fall? What are my relationships? What is the pain that I feel when I see suffering? And if my openness to the present is greater, then my response will be deeper. And out of such responses, one may get a future which is neither as we had imagined, nor as we had feared. So I feel that the point at which this environmental change and this societal change, this spiritual change even, the point at which it has to make a difference is the individual first. If we are healthier as individuals, deeply healthy and related to the world, then we will be, by and large, doing actions which are in good response to whatever is the situation that stands before us. And the responsiveness, I make a distinction between responsiveness and responsibility. Because responsibility comes with a preordained definition. It is your responsibility to take care of the environment. It is your responsibility to waste least things. So the responsibility, which yes, necessarily it can be defined, but it is not a personally felt thing. It's an abstraction which is from outside, which has been used to create guilt and pride. Pride that you fulfilled the responsibility. Guilt that you did not fulfill the responsibility. And by that, you are kept away from the present. Your perception of the present is clouded by the fact that you feel guilty or you feel rather good at what you're doing. If one is really sharply aware, then one's actions follow from that. Then we can start thinking about systems a little later, about how we organize ourselves and so on. But I think the primary question is, how do human beings become more perceptive, more responsive, more able to feel both pain and joy without getting destroyed in the process? That is where it is.
So you're saying that it's in this moment, then what we are holding on to is really going back to ourselves and the way that we relate individually to things around us and becoming more aware of that.
Notice the phrase that you used, going back to ourselves. As if we were a point. Huh? So there's that very wonderful Zen master's statement which says, this paper, the cloud is in it. So the student was puzzled. Then the master says, it was made out of the wood of a tree, which grew because there was rain. Rain could only fall if there was a cloud. And the cloud is in this. Now, in the same way, I think the interconnectedness, if we learn to see ourselves as huge webs rather than points, then there is neither going back. There is only a change of focal length. You know, whether you are focusing on the close-up or whether you are focusing on the whole thing, it is you. And even science tells us that now, that we are so connected that it is impossible to think of yourself as a point in space, separate from every other point. That science of billiard balls, all separate and completely disconnected, that's no longer the science we are thinking about. And I think we have to reimagine, therefore re-perceive the relationship in space between the far and the near. And at the very near point, what happens is present at the far points. And what happens at the far points is present near. And if that is the case, then we start thinking about space differently. So we don't think of confinement, that we have been confined, but we think that the focus of our attention is in a closer dimension. But at the same time, that closer dimension allows one to refocus on the bigger dimension from time to time. My physical body is here. But my mind is open, my heart is open, and therefore we are able to be not confined. Nobody is confined. Nobody is distanced really. I mean, if at all, people are talking more to each other than before.
Yeah,
I
that is true.
talk to my family, far off people, as much as I have talked in this period. Huh?
Yeah, yeah,
So,
yeah.
what is that far, or what is that confinement? Is something which is the very question that we are now suddenly realizing, that what is confinement?
I think that's a very beautiful thought about presence and how actually we are part of a larger web rather than being points. But I'm just wondering that there is also this tendency of rushing back to how life used to be. So earlier, when the lockdown was there were reports of the Yamuna clearing up. There were reports of skies clearing up. We've experienced fresher air. And now with the lockdown being eased out, pollution is back and business seems to be back to as usual. So therein comes in a huge challenge to this idea of reimagining who we are and how we are interconnected. Again, it is a problem of this contradiction of there's a lot of pessimism that this is the end of the world, and then there is too much of optimism that everything is fine, right? So what is the
Everything is fine. Let's go back to, if things are going to go back, they're going to become normal.
So the question really is that this reimagination that you referred to, how could one actually practice it?
There is a machine which is trying to make you pessimistic and optimistic. That you will buy certain things in order that your pessimism is reduced, and it will offer you all kinds of things. So that machine has its own goals. But the individual is the individual. And the real question of choice, what the machine says, is that the choice is that you can have blue shoes or red shoes or yellow shoes. But the choice that I want is I want to feel the earth and I don't want to wear chappals, or that I don't want to feel cold and I want proper boots. But that's my choice. Or I don't want anything at all. That I've got enough. Yeah. So the machine will immediately, and already it has started trying to get things into original shape. Yeah? And it will take maybe 20 years for individuals to affect the machine. Or it took one world war for the European notion of what is a nation to change. Yeah? But so we won't be able to do it yet. We will have to have the fortitude and the internal balance to say, yes, the machine exists. I will not be. So I think this thing about the moving from extreme to extreme is something which is very useful to the entire system, that machine. And if we don't get into it, then they don't know what to do. Yeah. So I think we've got to fool the machine, basically. Thousands of us, millions of us. Yeah.
Yeah. What I really like in what you said is that it may take 20 years, but the point is it started.
It's happening in a big way. And the major thing that we'll have to be careful about is we don't stop listening, that we do not allow it to become just the violence of one viewpoint versus another.
Yeah.
And that one uses the media that are now available to us to actually listen.
Right.
We are using them now to shout.
Right.
And so listening, if it becomes more possible, dialogue, if it becomes more possible, as a result of this slowing down that we have experienced, that we understand now that, wow, there is great pleasure in the slow listening to each other. And if that is so, if that we let grow, so we'll have to be very, very um, astute in the kinds of things that we start promoting or doing ourselves and hoping that others will also enjoy it, like what you're doing with these conversations. Yeah?
So this actually takes me to the next question of when you're talking about listening. You of course have been involved with pedagogy for a very long time. So you will know better than anybody that learning requires sharing of space. It requires observation. It requires the picking up of subconscious clues, subtle gestures, postures, facial expressions, tonality and temper of voice and sound and so on and so forth. Now, when we are actually exchanging ideas or we are communicating across this flattened digital space, what do you think now is the scope for learning or this listening that you talked about, which essentially is haptic?
It's a very, very difficult question that all of us who are in the process of speaking and listening, watching and following, all of this, we are grappling with this reality of how to do this in a way in which it doesn't lose the immediacy of contact. Let us say there may be other senses apart from the visual, the oral, and the haptic. There may be other ways of sensing which we may discover, I do not know. But the fact is that we all struggle to find the directness of the contact. Now, when it is with three of us, it's comparatively easier.
Yeah.
Even though I'm seeing you on a screen, I can see your every expression with great clarity. But if I have 40 students in a class, it becomes difficult because you've got a screen full of faces. Then it's so difficult. So one will have to, for example, yesterday I was with a group of students and we decided that from next week onwards, we will meet in smaller bunches, maybe 10 at a time. And we will talk to each other as a small group rather than, which as in person-to-person contact, the 40 was possible. Not at that time. But in this sense now, one will have to find out how to take care of attention, our own attention, as teachers or as students. And it is the harvesting of attention which will really be the thing that we will have to work on. Because one of the things about this medium, and you have seen that while we are talking, some pings happen. That was some other messaging service which was trying to come in.
Yes.
Problem with this is that the easy way of being distracted is available.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And it is so tough to keep attending to, being present to the person you are talking to.
Yes.
That is what, even what, I have noticed that teachers in a jury, for example, will look at messages. So already that attention had frittered. Maybe this is a warning sign of a certain kind. It says, there it is.
Just extending this question into architectural education, because architectural education has got so much to do with making things, building things. So yeah, you can have this conversation on the screen and we can try and pay attention, but actually going out, experiencing, building, observing, uh, how do you see that playing out now, in the next few months? But we don't know when
Yeah,
colleges are going to start back.
anyways, this entire semester, I think most universities have declared online.
One thing that may happen, or we may have to look at, is to take uh, projects which do not have a peculiar and particular context. That we may have to think of the universality of a question rather than the particularity of a question. This is a loss in a certain way, but it also is a stimulus to thinking. For example, if you look at the end of the First World War, where through the war they had realized that they had become over particularized in nation states and so on. And the artists and the architects all went out to say, no, there is a universal language. Now here we will not look for a universal language because the universal language is an oppressive language. It doesn't take into account the various traditions of thought. So therefore, we will have to let surface a kind of thought which is not abstract and devoid of particularities, but which is open enough to transact with particularity. It's a very difficult thing. But I think this is where the new model of thinking about architecture will be to think about what Kant used to call form and translate to design. Of late, we had been looking at design. Yeah? Form is what is the inherent, indivisible character of the human interaction in an institution such as this, or the institutions of man, as Kant used to call them. Therefore, there will be deep exploration of that. And I think that may be a good corrective to many things that we did in recent times. It will be a loss in some ways because going into a context and learning it first-hand experience of that place is very important. But if we have opened minds rather than stuffed them, then going back into context will be possible. Yeah? The main thing I think we will again come back to the responsiveness versus responsibility.
Yes.
How do we cultivate responsiveness? How do we cultivate fearlessness, courage, open-mindedness, sense of adventure, and a kind of peaceful absorption of the world as it is? How do we do that is something from where that new response to the context will come. If the student has become responsive. So I know of, for example, some music teachers who for a long time will not teach you anything. Only listen to your voice as it comes out. I have a friend here, and Mahendra Toke is a marvelous teacher. He will not teach you till your voice starts coming out sahaj, natural, in your own way, not in the way he's teaching you. So you become responsive to your body and to the air and their coexistence. And then after that, you start saying, all right, let me pick that line and see what happens with it. And so what we may now have to do is to tune ourselves and our students into a responsiveness without getting shaken. without getting fearful and without becoming violent. I think this will be also very important, that one will have to have a steady and peaceful gaze. They say the gaze of art is peaceful, and that is somewhere where we have to reach. So in small groups, how to do that? That is something which all of us are struggling with at the moment.
Going back to the question of interconnectedness, what you spoke about. Um, Now with physical isolation becoming a kind of necessity, at least currently, um, as architects, how do we in our work uh, respond to this interconnectedness to other beings, and also create empathy, because at the moment somehow that is what seems threatened in some ways, because you have to stay away from the other might have a virus, etc. So how do we make people aware of our interconnectedness as beings, and how do we cultivate empathy?
When you first asked me this question, my thoughts went back to my grandmother, who was so old and she couldn't go anywhere. Um, so she would sit in the same place every afternoon. And after some years of doing this, she could tell you the exact time, because she had observed the shadows in all the seasons. And all she was doing while sitting there was soaking in the sun in that cold Nairobi climate and watching the shadows, which to her was sufficiently rich an existence. Or then I was thinking about, I had been to Le Toronnet, which is a monastery in France, where the monks had to all day long and in every season, they would walk around the ambulatory, which had columns, beautiful arched opening, regularly spaced on all four sides. And the floor went up and down. The height of these things changed a bit. And I was imagining that if all through the year, every day you were given one question to walk through the day and think over, you would also be noticing the sunlight, you would be noticing the leaves or the lack of leaves on the trees, you would be noticing the snow, you would be noticing the birds, in addition to yourself. So the work of architecture on one side has to be something which promotes relationships between humans. And those relationships are under a kind of a control situation now. But the work of architecture is also supposed to be your relationship to the cosmos. So if we keep in mind that at some point in time, humans will be able to come together. Yeah? They might even be able to hug each other. Who knows? Yeah? They might kiss for all we know. Yeah? That also is possible. It's not that it will be completely forbidden. So if you say that there will be a return of a certain kind to the basic, shall we say, creatural humanity that we have. Creatural humanity is bodies, and bodies which love the presence of other bodies. Yeah? And which like the sound of other voices, and which get very, very satisfied when they feel as part of that kind of a group. So that will come back, I think. So for the moment, we should say we know what that is by and large. We can imagine it. We keep designing for that, but now is the time to also make sure that we are designing for our relationship with a much larger sentient and non-sentient existence. Yeah? For example, I've seen that now in sort of messages coming across, lot more people are sending photographs of a bird that they saw or a flower that just grew outside their porch, and they are suddenly becoming alive to that. Or amongst my young friends, I've seen photographs of the sky have become common. That this evening it was fantastic. I think earlier, perhaps they weren't even seeing that. So, if this allows us to expand our awareness and we make architecture also in the same spirit, then we will be able to take into account that the mm, basic pleasure of being alive is being alive in the presence of everything. And that presence takes a human form at times.
So in this, you have in a way answered one of the questions that we had about possible future forms of public space. So you are saying that it is not just relationship of people to people, it is also relationship to other beings and relationship to the larger cosmos. So that in a way is what you're suggesting as the future of the public space. We have to conceive one. However, when we are facing this uncertainty around gathering spaces, how do we regroup? How do we regroup to celebrate as well as to agitate?
You know, you might have gone in a barat, part of a group sometime. Huh? Maybe it's about at the most 100 people walking with the groom in front and everybody else following. Now imagine if it was 1,000 people. Imagine if it was 10,000 people. Imagine if it was 1 lakh people. Then the nature of that occasion changes. And what we now call public space as the space of gathering, it had its limits because of the limits of the human body. For example, Kesarbai was famous for being able to sing so loudly that 1,000 people could hear her. Or Fayaz Khan Sahab. That Fayaz Khan Sahab could sing and they trained their voice like that. Yeah? But beyond 1,000, no. It is the music of 100, 200, 300 people. Yeah. Like that, I think cities, the moment we started thinking that we have to have a lot of bodies of laborers in a space where they can reach their workplace, which has to be, in a particular location quickly, and we can observe them working and keep an eye on them and see that they work all at the same pace and, in the same motions so that they don't waste any energy or time. If we do all that, for that we made cities become larger and larger and larger and larger. And public space also became like that. So I think we have to think about scale now. How much can a human being walk? What are the distances of walking, and can we make the city and its public spaces? Because if it is walking distance, then you're going to have a city of maybe 100,000 people or 500,000 people, but not more. And you will then have the gathering spaces of a scale where the contact between you and me becomes not a mob-like contact, but a face-to-face contact. See how the tribals in the Northeast, for example, carry out their meetings or used to, where the face-to-face contact created a certain ethic that you could not tell a lie. You could not make claims which are wrong because your peers were in front of you and they knew what you were saying. So that if we bring back that something of the modification of that scale, and if the whole democratic process is working from there, then the serious questions of discrimination and oppression will have to be tackled at that scale, whether of caste or of gender or of any other form. That will have to be tackled at the scale where the basic dignity of each person is respected. Now, this is a very, very excellent task. I think it's a task in which one would love to be participant. One should be. And then from that can follow, or with that, simultaneous with that, we propose the architectures of a human scale. And I think these two go hand in hand. Then your public space also will become not a kind of a vast Maidan which has to carry 10,000 people, but it will become maybe a chalk, or it will become a nukkad of a kind. These are the kind of things that we will have to look for. And I think scale is the one thing which we have really gone wrong on, simply because we need plenty of cheap labor and obedient labor. And that is where I think the system itself needs to be asked questions.
I think this is touching upon our question regarding this relationship between the city and the hinterland, because what we have found in the crisis is that the mega cities have been the hardest hit, and the city, the metropolis, was the center of power, economy, opportunity, and everybody wanted to live in the city. And when the disease hit, the workforce that actually had built it, the workers that you're talking about, there was no space for them in the city, and they had to walk back to their rural habitats, which were comparatively safer and secure. So the question is, what are the lessons that we draw from this, and how do we rethink this relationship between the city and the rural habitats?
It's something similar to talking about the individual as a point versus a network. And I think we have fallen into a kind of model of thinking of the city as completely and utterly different from the rural. I'll give you an example. Some years ago, I took students to do some measured drawing in Tamil Nadu. And we were in the area around Kumbakonam. Now, that is an area which is all rice fields, and small villages, call them, or small towns scattered across. Every 10 kilometers you come to a town. Amazing thing was, every one of them had a school, had a dispensary, had health facilities. They had some kind of business. Either it would be rice milling, or it could be bronze work, or it could be basketry, or whatever it was. There was a specificity to that, each of them. And there was also very often a college, somewhere a commerce college, somewhere a medical college, somewhere something else. So what had happened was a kind of urbanism which was distributed across the landscape. No settlement was more than maybe 50,000, 100,000, 200,000 max. Maybe Kumbakonam is bigger, but still. All the other ones were small, and they were within 10, 15, 20 kilometers of each other, well connected. And people who wanted to buy a basket could go to that other village. Somebody who needed to get some work done in metal would go to Swami Malai. And that was within half an hour's bus ride. Yeah? So this was a different kind of urbanism, where a population of maybe 2 million was spread over the landscape. Now this required many other backups. It required an agriculture which has a certain stability, so that the value of land was not only best when it was utilized for building, but it was also in itself, it was a productive thing. So how do we give value to agriculture? Then the fact that crafts are at remote locations and skills are not concentrated in one place. And that with today's communications, it is quite easy to send a WhatsApp with a drawing to the carpenter 30 kilometers away and get the windows done and bring them back, on a tempo within 3 days' time or something like that. So that the whole system, instead of saying, let's all gather at Kumbakonam, they had distributed. If we think about an urbanity which doesn't over-concentrate and leave vacant and vacuous the remaining land. Over much of North and Northwest India, Northwest especially, this is what has happened. That we have created huge vacant lands, and we have created great concentrations, which might be partly because of the climate, the geography, the kind of production that's possible, etc. So we may have to think about some more ways of, but that's one. Second is that the idea that skills can be distributed across geographies, and that what Gandhiji had said, 30 kilometers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then I started looking at an old plans of Ahmedabad. So if you take the walled city, then at about 5 kilometers distance, there is the first ring of villages. Naurangpura and Badaj, and all of them were that distance on the other side also. And then at 20 kilometers is the next ring. And in this area, it was very clear that if you're a trader in grain, then your connections were Asarwa and Sadara. If you're a trader in metals, your connection was so and so and so. And therefore, the actual production took place outside. Also because you didn't want to pay the tax within the city. If you brought it in the wall, you had to pay tax. So you could do production and distribute it in so many other places. So in fact, the geography became alive with distinctions. Now what has happened is, there is no such thing as a skill. There is either a laborer or an owner. So if it did not concentrate like this, for that you need to have first a sense of proportion about how much we need. Like the amount of concentration of money that is required for a kind of showing off is something, and that comes with an entire system. Yes. So there have been people who have said, no, I will not do this, I will not do this. But I think this, just after independence or before independence, it had become the norm for every group of socialized people to say, we will not spend on weddings. We will not waste on weddings. Yeah? And we had simplified. Now again, the great Indian wedding has come back, and there are people who sell you the various things. Yeah, they will be willing to sell. I mean, a good long big wedding and all that. So that is all to be seen now. It will require the thinking about the city in particular. Will require a recognition of human dignity, not just a recognition of distribution of resources, but a recognition of the dignity of every person who is near or far from the city, within the city or outside the city. When that happens, then we'll start getting a different kind of planning.
That this brings us to the last question of our session today, again related to urbanity and development. You've worked extensively in housing, not only in your practice of architecture, but also teaching housing. So the once frothing debate around development, which was low rise, high density versus high rise and low density, now seems to be contained in socio-economic ghettos. What I mean by that is high rise, low density is now reserved for the privileged who prefer generous margins around, while low rise and high density is reserved for people who are underprivileged, who are used to living in the margins. Although the pandemic is considered to be a great leveler, but I think uh, the language, the terminology around this pandemic is also being set by the privileged. Simply an example towards this is that we refer to social distancing. Actually, it should be physical distancing, because we are not going away socially. We're just supposed to maintain physical distance. So coming back to my question, what is it that we are looking at in terms of the future of housing development within cities, whether it's the cities that you are imagining, which is kind of respecting the dignity of people, not just distribution of resources, or we go back to business as usual, although we know very well it's not going to be business as usual. So what do you see as the future of housing?
Yeah. So first of all, the polarity that you mentioned of low rise, high density and high rise, low density. Actually, the density in both are the same.
Okay.
If you actually calculate the square meterage or the number of people, it is only that by affording to build something so tall, which costs a lot of money, that you are releasing land, which then becomes open space. And in order to do that, you have to charge a lot. You have to pay for the making the building, and you have to also pay for buying the land and doing all that. Whereas in the other case, the land is comparatively distributed, and also because everybody has to pay for the land and gets that much. And therefore, remaining open space is much less. Now, there have been good examples of low-rise, high-density. Even in places like Ahmedabad or Calcutta, they have been appreciated even by those who are able to afford anything that they want. Okay? So it is not necessary that high-rise is the only solution. And recent one of the articles by one of the Arab engineers, and this is by a structural engineer, and he said we should stop building towers because they are wasteful, they consume a lot of energy, you need to use materials which have to be extracted at great cost to the earth's ecology, etc. And therefore he said we should go for low rise and same density. Yeah? So around the world, there is a questioning of the tower model. Yeah. Of course, there is a kind of shall we say, a psychological feeling of superiority.
Yeah. Condominiums in the clouds.
Yeah, and no, and also towers have always been,
Yeah.
features of
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
warlike peoples.
Yeah.
They want to go be high and go and shoot arrows on everybody who is down below. Yeah. So the sense of um, being in charge, sense of ruling over everything, is something which has led to higher and higher buildings and higher statues. So that is something which will uh, we will have to understand that there will be humans who will want this high. Yeah. But for the rest, I think there should be reasonable efforts at making cities which are not that ghettoized, first of all, which are more open. And low rise allows open and still protected. Yeah, because you don't have to have the security people. There are people themselves who are doing the security, as Jane Jacobs has shown. And if we use that model, maybe we will be able to make cities which are more human in their scale also. So scale and a sort of a more mm, evolved understanding of what it means to have a good house and a good neighborhood, and the effort to achieve that. I think that can be achieved with, but again, it will require lot of very, very high quality work from architects to achieve that. And it is a good challenge that we can take up. Um, and we will have to not fear the commercial builder. We will have to propose to that group also that there could be other ways of doing it. So I think overall, housing, which was a way of saying each human feels that she is given a certain amount of dignity, but also that she is connected to others at her choice. I think that will have to come back into being the main agenda of housing. How do you do housing, taking the individual and the collective as both important things? This distancing which we are right now facing, and you're quite right to call it physical distancing, not social distancing, has to be, because this social distancing also is a very bad effect that some people have. Uh, there was an article by Shweta Wagh and Hussain Indorwala recently, in which they talked about how they tried to promote the view that Dharavi had more coronavirus cases than rest of Bombay. But there are no figures to prove that. And that the richer part of Mumbai had almost the same number of cases, or perhaps, and so we want to box this into something which we can forget about.
Yeah.
And I think that if we basically, as a society, we have not developed a sense of being um, being responsive to all our people. And we have not developed a sense of being compassionate towards my own. And that is something which I think a lot of work will need to be done before an architect can even get a project in which he or she can demonstrate this. And this is something as a society, and societies across the world are now taken over by the machine in that way. And it will take thousands of individuals to not to buy houses in other things or make houses here and there. And we will have to find out how we'll start making a difference. As long as we understand it, we might start making a difference. And that is where the whole thing will lie.
So,
Yeah.
so thank you so much, Professor Chhaya, again for your generosity and accommodation and this very constructive conversation. And we really look forward to more such occasions, and hopefully we'll keep coming up with programs at the vessel or even otherwise to get in touch with you again. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
so much.
Thank you
Thank
so
you
much.
very much. And it was great to be with two of you again. Thank
Yes.
you.